Welcome to Chapter 2 of the Candy Corn Contest by Patricia Riley Giff. It was almost time to go home. Richard was sick of waiting for show and tell. All right, Miss Rooney said at last. Who has something to tell us? Richard waved his hand around in the air. Miss Rooney picked Emily Arrow. Emily hurried to the front of the room. She was wearing red sneakers. Her legs looked like Slim Jim pretzels. I went to my Aunt Helen's wedding on Saturday, Emily said. I'll tell you all about it. Richard wiggled around in his seat. Emily told about the bride's dress and the bridesmaids' dresses. She told about the wedding cake. Richard sighed in a loud voice. Emily danced around in her sneakers. This is the way the bride danced, she said. Richard looked at the other kids. Timothy was reading a book as fast as he could. He'd have about 5 guesses by tomorrow. He might win the jar of candy corn before Richard guessed once. Suddenly, Emily saw Timothy reading. She frowned. I guess that's all, she said. She raced back to her seat and opened her library book. Miss Rooney looked around. Richard put his hand in the air. He knelt up on his seat so Miss Rooney would look at him. Sit down, Richard, Miss Rooney said. She looked around the room. Wayne O'Brien went to the front of the room. He stood there for a minute. Then he shook his head. I don't remember what I was going to say. In front of him, Richard could hear Matthew trying to read. He didn't know the words. At last, Wayne raised his shoulders up to his neck. He went back to his seat. Miss Rooney smiled at Richard. Do you have something? Richard rushed to the front of the room. He took a deep breath. I'm going to have a sleepover, he said. Everyone's invited. Emily looked up from her book. Great, she said. Richard swallowed. I mean the boys, only the boys. It's a sleepover party for boys. Oh, said Emily Arrow. There isn't room for girls, Richard said. All right, Emily said. I'm coming, yelled Matthew. When is it? The night after Thanksgiving, Richard said. Timothy Barbero put his hand in the air. Will there be good stuff to eat? Sure, Richard said. My mother's making spaghetti and Italian bread and leftover turkey, and we're going to have ice cream for dessert. Derek Grace raised his hand. I can't come, he said. He looked as if he were going to cry. I'm going to my Uncle John's. I can't come either, Jason Bazik said. Richard looked around. Not so good. Now there would be only 6 counting himself. Don't worry, Matthew called again. I'm coming. I love ice cream. Richard went back to his seat. You're coming, aren't you? He called to Timothy Barbero. I think so, Timothy said. Dawn Bosco was up in the front of the room. My grandmother lives in Florida, she said. She held up a fat grapefruit. My grandmother sent us a whole box of these. Richard shuddered. He hated grapefruit. He opened his book to page 3. Last week he had read 2 pages. Maybe he could get 2 guesses. As soon as Dawn sat down, he raised his hand. Can I use last week's books for a guess? Miss Rooney thought for a moment. Oh, good, Timothy Barbero said. I read about 100 pages last week. Miss Rooney shook her head. I think we'd better stick to this week. We'll start with today. Richard looked at page 3. He tried to read the first sentence. It was a tough one. He turned to page 4. A nice big picture took up most of the space. He wouldn't have to read many words if he ever got there. Timothy Barbero raised his hand. I started my new book this morning, he said, and now I'm almost finished. That's wonderful, Miss Rooney said. Richard looked at Timothy. Timothy was smart and he was lucky. Richard wished he was like Timothy. He was sick of being dumb and unlucky. So tomorrow we'll read chapter 3. Bye.